us know.
Welcome, Sean Mulholland. Lovely to have you here with us. Hopefully at that time over lunch to get conversations going, or at least give you some little bit of stimulation. We begin our afternoon sessions with Professor John Barry. John is Professor of Green Political Economy and co-director of the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action at Queen's University, Belfast. He's also co-chair of the Belfast Climate Commission. Having welcomed John into conversations with Corrymeela before, though it was online, again it's nice to be in person, I am aware how much admiration we have for John as someone who challenges us as people of faith, who does not allow the brokenness of what we have accepted as normal to go unnoticed, and who balances that radical call to a deeper action with an affable nature that reminds us that so much of what is hard and necessary in this life is about human beings learning how to be better humans with each other, individually and globally. That is a very long-winded way of saying that I fully expect there will be some digs at Americans in the next John will be speaking beyond carbon growth and capitalism, after which he will entertain our questions. This Q&A at the end of this hour may be a little shorter, so that we can be in our next places by 3 p.m. for the workshops. And I think there's some talk that John may actually have his group outside.
Yeah, mine's going to be outside too.
Excellent. So the places we have assigned are just starting points or suggestions. You just follow Martin and John. Will you please join me in welcoming Professor John Barry?
Alex and Corrymeela for inviting me here this afternoon. If Martin was practicing what he preaches, I'm going to practice what I teach in terms of what I'm going to offer you today. For full disclosure, I stand before you as a worried father, a recovering politician, which showing signs of recidivism, a Marxist-inspired professor of heterodox economics, who for over 30 years has attempted and gloriously failed to get my institution to entertain moving beyond teaching economics as capitalism and as economic growth. And when I say Marxist, we must remember that Marxism is a Christian heresy. Marxism is a politics of redemption with its holy books and its secular saints. So I'm a very ethical atheist. And further, to build these links between Marxism, which inspires my work and my activism, and remember many of you here are from faith background, you must always remember that wonderful phrase from Archbishop Corrymeela, murdered Brazilian by the military junta, who wisely said, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. And when I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist." So I invite you all to become communists. And for those who have heard me speak before, and some of you have, I find as I get old and I'm quietly quitting the university, I'm really taking a dig not on Americans, but actually at the higher education institutions that I'm involved in, that I do think I'm now becoming like Van Morrison. I have one good song where I confuse repetition for development. So, are we all sitting comfortably? There's probably an audience that gets that reference. Because I am here to talk about the necessity of revolution. We are way past the time for reform. We are way past the time for mythic thinking of technological solutions to the crisis that we face. We need a revolution in how we organise our societies and our economies. We need a revolution in our thinking. What is the good life in the 21st century? What is a good society in the 21st century, in the age of, sometimes called by my colleagues, the Anthropocene, this rather fancy term, the age of the human. I think that's nonsense. We're in the age of the Capitalocene. Not all of humanity is responsible for the horrors that we're now witnessing. And we need a revolution in our culture, a revolution in our ethics, and we need to expand our compassion in time to future generations, to other people in other parts of the world in terms of global justice, and most challengingly, particularly for Western people like ourselves, expand our compassion to the non-human world. and talk about the rights of nature, and to include those in our circle of compassion. So I'm here to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. And too many of us are far, far too comfortable when it comes to this thing. And I'm here to talk not about optimism, but about hope. Optimism is the happy idea that's all going to work out. It's what we say here in Ireland, it'll be grand. It won't be grand. Because what distinguishes hope from optimism are two things. To be genuinely hopeful, you have to countenance failure. Optimism is an investment, it's an easy investment, things are going to be okay. Hope, you have to really consciously foreground an anticipation of potential failure, which is why a religious perspective is very useful. Faith becomes an issue here in terms of how do we overcome that sense perhaps that it won't work out as we want it to. But the other thing about hope that's different than optimism is agency. You've got to be active, you've got to act to be hopeful. And I'll talk about in my few remarks here about one particular type of dangerous thinking that dominates our politics, our policy, which is technological optimism. We can outsource the solution to these problems to boffins like me, God forbid, idiots like Elon Musk who want to wish us off to Mars, or some other technical solution. But there's another form of passivity, which I see every year, and I have the great benefit and privilege of engaging with young minds every year, and to start the term this week. But I am noticing amongst my student body, we don't talk about this enough, certainly not in the academy, of climate anxiety, of eco-grief, of actually not being post-traumatized, but pre-traumatized. Grieving for a way of life that's no longer possible. And we don't talk enough about the emotional impact, particularly scientists. I don't know whether our previous speakers will have anything to say on that. But I have colleagues in the natural sciences in particular who do work on the climate and they're clinically depressed. Because they're like me, they're fathers, they're worried about their children, they've been doing their work dutifully for decades, giving it to the government and getting it reviewed in peer-reviewed journals, and nothing happens. COP has become a cop-out. We've had 3 decades of these international meetings. Global emissions haven't decreased. We have the nonsense that we had at the COP27 of Sultan Al-Jaber. And this is really a dangerous issue of how our political leaders are thinking in terms of this technological vision. What we need to reduce, said he, is not fossil fuel use, but the emissions. Very important distinction. Because what he's betting on, and not only him, are negative emissions technologies. Some way of continuing burning. And this is the carbon indulgences that Martin spoke about. It's like St. Augustine said, Lord, make me chaste, but not just yet. Lord, make us net zero carbon, but not just yet. Let's kick it down to 2050, and so on. And I would take inspiration from a Christian, very well-known climate scientist called Mike Hume. I don't know whether people have heard of him. I'd encourage you to read his book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, probably the best book on the topic. And he said, it's not what we can do for the climate, that kind of male enlightenment, kind of Western, arrogant, technological issue, we've got to solve this problem. It's not what we can do for the climate, we should reverse that. It's what the climate can do for us. What can it offer us in terms of new opportunities to rethink the good life, the good society, our expanding circle of compassion. So I want to offer you 2 cheers for the apocalypse. We have this very, wrong view in English-speaking cultures about the apocalypse. Well, in the ancient Greek, the apocalypse means the lifting of a veil. It's a revelation. It's an opportunity. So I do think there are virtues in apocalyptic thinking, which to me are part of what I was saying earlier about the issue of hope. And in particular, I'd much rather, as I'm quietly quitting the academic game, engage in these types of meetings. And I was talking to Ian White earlier on about the ways in which these enormously powerful, well-resourced institutions, universities, should be doing more of these community gatherings. We are in a crisis. And yet the universities continue in a business-as-usual manner. We are failing our young people by not giving them the causes, the uneven and unjust consequences of the planetary crisis, mostly being visited on the global south, and what are the potential solutions or adaptive mechanisms. So I think we have a duty of care. And for those of you who are alumni of universities, or still have an involvement with universities, please do me a favour and write to the Vice-Chancellor or whatever power you have in terms of getting universities to put on a mandatory course that every student, from physics to philosophy, has some exposure to these issues we've been talking about today, because that's the world that's going to determine what jobs they will have. It will determine their life chances. And as I've sadly discovered in my teaching, where I've had women in my classes come up to me and say, well, do you ever dress decently, or professor, you know, the stadium? No, apart from that, these young women have decided not to have children. And I don't know what to do with that. It apparently breaks my heart. That's how I don't set out to do that. They're obviously adults that make up their own mind. But that's what I'm talking about, the seriousness of what we're in. We need the head that academics do up the wazoo. We need the hand, actually to do things, but most important is the heart. The emotional impact, connect with our values and so on. And we don't talk enough about this, not in politics. Certainly when I'm a politician, if even to talk about emotions, as I would absolutely get you dirty looks from other politicians. And I say, well, you're not a human being, you don't have kids. I think we need to have a more open conversation and be kind to each other and talk about kindness and love in the public space. I mean, actually, that's what justice is. There's a wonderful African-American academic who's a bit of a hero of mine, Cornell West, you may have heard of. And he said, justice is what love looks like in the public space. So why can't we talk about love? Love for our children. Love for place, for planet, for people. And to really start connecting this issue with our deepest emotions, which are about love. Yes, they can be about fear, but also about hope. Numbers, as somebody said, a pie chart never motivated anybody. A story did. And I'm going to tell you the story of the greatest story never told, which is the story of economic growth. And if I could come back, I could tell you it has its origins in Ireland, in Cromwellian colonised Ireland in the 17th century, with a geezer called Sir William Petty, but Shinsuke Ella. I'll tell that another time. But economic growth, I think, should be, for those of you again with an audience like this, as old as I am, you get the Monty Python sketch of the dead parrot. Economic growth and capitalism is a dead parrot. Let's give it a good burial, thank it for its services, and move on as quickly and as elegantly and as justly as we can. So, particularly the last one. Because people don't understand often that I was on strike, for example, like many university lecturers over the last couple of years, for our pensions. Pension scheme invested in fossil fuels. And many in the room here, our pension schemes invested in fossil fuels. And if you think about it, if it's wrong to wreck the planet, surely it's wrong to profit from wrecking the planet. So in moving away from a carbon-based energy system, that's fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, we all have to disentangle and recreate a financial system as we do that, because they are inextricably linked. This is a good dinner party conversation. And it shows you how difficult it is. Everything from the rather good coffee from Corrymeela in my tummy, my contact lenses, the electricity powering this, our synthetic clothes, if you wash your hair with shampoo, all of it, food, energy, transport, all comes from the burning of fossil fuels. That's the scale of the challenge, but it's also the opportunity in terms of a just transition. I mean, that's what a just transition means. How do we gracefully leave fossil fuels in the ground, or leave the oil in the soil, the coal in the hole, and the frack in the crack? We have the scientific evidence. We cannot, this is called unburnable fossil fuels. I'm afraid to tell you here today, 1.5 is gone. We are not going to keep the global average increase to 1.5. In my view, 2%, 2 degrees is gone. But that doesn't mean we should lose hope. It means we have to be honest about our failure up to now. 3 decades of COPs, so what? In case you didn't know, many of the parliaments that are giving us legislation, whether it's in the UK, Ireland, whether it's the Northern Ireland Assembly, whether it's your local council, most of them in the UK and Ireland, at every level of government, from local up to national, have declared a climate and ecological emergency. Did you know that? No, most people don't. It is the WTF. What does that mean? You've declared an emergency and then what has happened? I'll tell you what an emergency is, the pandemic. I'll tell you what an emergency is, the Second World War. So we're going to start looking at, if we really accept that we are in an emergency, we have to resolutely move beyond a business as usual model. And that means, in my view, moving beyond capitalism. That's simply the name of the system, the economic system we have at the moment, for science-based reasons. Yes, as I said to you, I am a Marxist. So I'm anti-capitalist. I want to see a situation, as I was talking to somebody earlier. In the course of my career in the academy, I have seen education go to being a right, to being a commodity. Your ability to pay, not your academic ability, now determines whether or not you go to university. So we are living in a corrosive capitalist system, and it's particularly corrosive on young people in terms of consumerism, advertising and marketing. That's why never, ever, ever read beauty magazines. They only make you feel ugly. That is the point of them. When was the last time you've seen an advertising billboard or an ad? Like, John, you're looking good. You know, COVID wasn't good to you, so you've got a few pounds to lose, but more or less you're looking good. On you go. The whole point of advertising and marketing, and never ever believe the nonsense. Oh well, advertising doesn't really work. Well, why is it a multi-billion-pound industry? It doesn't work. The whole point of advertising is to make us buy stuff we don't need to impress people we don't care about. So part of capitalism is to inculcate in us this sense of a lack or a want. So our current economic system is unsustainable. And particularly, I know Jane isn't here now, Jane Corduroy, who leads up the climate change and green growth element. She knows my views about green growth, as does the Minister. I publicly challenged him on green growth there at a meeting 2 weeks ago, and we, as I said, respectfully disagreed in terms of, he didn't offer any argument. I have science behind what I'm saying here, in terms of we need to move beyond this economic growth model. And we cannot continue in a business as usual manner and have a habitable world for the future. So what we need, and it's already been touched upon by Martin, by Stephanie, by Ray, is a change in non-technological, so the recreation of community at the local level to become place protectors. So I'd offer you a view of what you're doing in Yorkshire. You're place protectors. You're protecting a place, but that's a change, that's not a technological change. And there's also an issue then around, we do need technology, but it cannot be that the transition is around ground source heat pumps, electric cars and solar panels. The vast majority of members of our community cannot afford that. That individual level way of managing the planet is not going to work. We need a much bigger structural one, of the like of which, as I say, wartime mobilisation and the pandemic stand as imperfect models of what we can learn about state and society action. So what I want to say is that we now have science-based arguments to move beyond economic growth, and moving beyond economic growth, we move beyond capitalism, because capitalism effectively is a growth-based system. You know, profitability is about having more. A debt-based money system, so you borrow 100 quid in the bank, and depending on the interest rate, let's say it's 10%, you've got to pay back 110. So there's already an inbuilt growth dynamic. Last time I looked, the earth isn't growing. You know, and as Mark knows, a nice phrase, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature. So how can a subsystem, the human economy, how can that continually grow? It's like a balloon in a box. At some point, it's going to burst. Now, it hasn't because it's incredibly unequally distributed. We get the benefits in Victoria Square in Belfast or IKEA of the benefits of this global growth-based system in the global north. All of the pollution and the impact from the global south often. They get the ills, we get the benefits. That's why the balloon hasn't burst completely. But the reality is, sadly, most of the students who study economics at Queen's University Belfast or anywhere else, this is the nonsense they get. The economy can grow forever. Sadly, our policymakers are infected with this ideology, and I would say most people in the room. From the boardroom to the bar room, there's an assumption we have to grow. And there's not bad reasons for it. Growth is associated with maturation, development, progress. But growth after a point is cancer. So the issue here is not to be anti-growth. It's at what point do we move beyond quantitative growth to qualitative growth? There are biophysical limits to the ability of the human economy to extract resources, make things and dispose of them. There are non-negotiable. At this stage in the game, it's between physics and ideology. Nature always bats last. Nature has gone through 5 other mass extinction events, in case you didn't know. Nature will shrug us off like a bad cold. We're now going through the 6th great mass extinction event that's been mostly caused by human beings. So this is the question that I'd love to see answered by every economic, political commentator, politician. So whenever we have the next election, these are the questions that ask your prospective councillors, MLAs, MPs. Most of them haven't a clue. Well, just, you need growth. Would you ask them why? They don't really know. It's like the only tool you have is a hammer. Everything is a nail. So what we need to do is to say that there is no capitalist solution to our crisis. We are literally killing the life-supporting systems of the planet through this carbon growth-based economic model. There are other models available. Capitalism at most is maybe 200 years old. Our use of carbon energy at any scale is probably really since the Second World War. So we've lived lives without capitalism and without carbon. And it's not denying the benefits of both. That's the point. We don't continue using it. Why do we think we have to have capitalism always in the future? So our current system is addicted to economic growth. And this idea that we have that orthodox that simply mean, measured by money terms, GDP, gross national product or gross domestic product, as a permanent feature. Why can't it just be a temporary feature? Human beings don't grow forever. This is he patting his tummy, although we're doing a good job of it. We grow and then we engage in a process of homeostasis, or a steady state. We don't continually grow forever. So why do we think the human economy is going to grow forever? So there's a contradiction between the biophysical limits of what the planet can sustain and this growth-based capitalist system. And the reality is, particularly in the global north, the minority world where most of us live, growth is not really adding to our quality of life. Does your heart sing whenever the iPhone 57 comes out? Or a new brand of pot noodle comes out? It's, it has finished, in my view, making our lives appreciably any better. What we need is good quality free time, to be less stressed, to have more time to learn. There's no limits to the ability to learn, or to love one another, or to care for each other. There are no limits to those. And yet we don't have the time. I think time is the new radical currency of any revolutionary politics. We want meaningful free time and the basis of our needs having been met. So growth is no longer making our lives better. We have the evidence for this. And actually our societies become more unequal the more they depend upon economic growth. Who gets it? The elite, the top 1%, 5%. Most of the growth is actually not accruing to most of us in society. So essentially, we're up against this poor man here, our politicians, including perhaps Minister Muir, but he's not alone. Because, oh my God, capitalism, that sounds a bit Marxist. Well, you can be, but I'm offering you science-based reasons as well. And why can't we say, what's wrong with talking about capitalism? Sometimes to be on BBC Radio Ulster here, and I always love it when I'm able to talk about capitalism on the public airwaves. You just feel the intake of breath. Why can't we talk about it? That's what it is. It's not the economy, it's a capitalist economy. Let's just talk about it, let's be honest and tell the truth. about the way our economic system is operating. So Donald, if he does, that's why I'm going to propose my own option. And again, it is an offering. I can be dogmatic. How could you not be if you're a Marxist, of course? But I'm open to say, well, here's my proposition. We need something like eco-socialism. You know, a recovery of the welfare state, of state provision with communities, particularly of things like housing, education, food, energy, transport. I'm not talking about the state production of underwear. I think the market can deal with things like that. But the things that are absolutely necessary for life, food, shelter, heating, warmth, and so on, these things should be de-commodified, taken out of the market system, and made rights for people. Other things then can be commodities. But of course we've gone so far down that neoliberal capitalist hellhole that even to say that now sounds a bit utopian. Well, if, as I hope some of you may at least countenance, there is no capitalist solution to the crisis that we have to start thinking and say, okay, what about eco-socialism? You may have a different view, that's absolutely fine. And here's the science. The most frightening term I ever read in these absolutely dull readings, Martin's quite right, is the IPCC, just to throw into the acronym soup, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this was its concluding paragraph in a report from a couple of years ago. If we don't change, we're going to miss this rapidly closing window of opportunity. And look at that, a sustainable future for all. I mean, that's the equivalent of the world scientists screaming at the top of their voice, saying, change! But part of the problem is, even in the scientific community, and there's another report that's come out this past week from Lancet, the public planetary health report, 60 authors, 60 pages, not once is capitalism mentioned. They talk about transformation, change, and so on. So what is the reticence? It's a bit like years ago, no one talked about the C word. It wasn't capitalism. Cancer. No one talked about cancer. Or when I was growing up in Dublin in the 1960s and 70s, we talked about lesbians. We couldn't talk about these things in public, homosexuality. So what is it about we cannot talk openly and honestly as adults about the very system that we're all in that provides for our day-to-day needs in terms of this capitalist system? And it is a pity, and I don't know about anybody else from DERA is here, and certainly, you know, Jane and the Minister knows my views on this, and I do engage with our policy community and political community here. And I'm saddened to say that most of them just don't get it. They think the planetary crisis, an existential first for our species, and I've had to experience this before, it's like a normal policy system. Oh, throw a bit of money at it, a bit of technology, bada bing, bada boom, sorted. Okay, it's a bit bigger than that, but more or less it can fit within the parameters of our existing decision making. It isn't. It can't stay within what's sometimes called the Overton window. You know, you've heard that term. What's politically and policy acceptable. We have to break that window, because it is constraining our ability to have this habitable world for everybody. That's why wartime mobilisation, the pandemic, if it is an emergency, as our national, regional and local governments have all said, let's act as if it is an emergency. Because sadly, this is our business thinking. There is money to be made in extinction. There is money to be made in extinction. This is part of the capitalist irrationality, but also we trace its roots back to how we're teaching economics, our understanding of economics. Whereas on the BBC, which I'm constantly shouting at the television and texting into Radio Ulster whenever I see, you know, the nonsense, there's no money, the kitty is empty. Do we think Winston Churchill, in preparing for war, said, I don't know, they've got the money? It's a nonsense to think that the money is the problem. So Rachel Reeves, if you're listening, our new Chancellor, so Keir Starmer, the issue is not the money. The only thing that should concern us at this stage from a science-based background, do we have the physical capital, the skills, the land, the water, the resources, real world assets, not the money? That's what we need to be focused on. And too often we are deluded by our media, our political class, our policymakers and all, there's no money. Really sad, we're going to let people die, there's no money. You say, hold on a minute, we have enough capacity to grow food, nobody has to go to bed hungry. We have enough resources to retrofit our homes, nobody has to go to bed cold. Don't give me that crap about there's no money. So I do think we have to start getting wise to this myth, and it is a myth, Martin is quite correct in the stories. This is mythic thinking. That's the myth of austerity that we're now seeing the beginnings of austerity Mark II in the UK government. It's almost like sacrificing to appease the gods of the market. That's why Rachel Reeves and Sir Keir Starmer are doing what they're doing. It's going to be tough. But the financial markets are looking at Britain under a Labour government. You've got to get rid of that tax and spend ideology. And what they're effectively doing is like other prehistoric people did, of sacrificing the young to placate the gods. Very simply, we're simply a continuation of that mythic thinking. You don't believe me? Here's the about Antonio Guterres, UN General Secretary, who's actually more radical now than even some people in Extinction Rebellion in terms of calling it out as it is, including on the genocide that's going on in Gaza, which we shouldn't forget. That is inextricably linked to what we're talking here. We have ecocide going on, as well as genocide and indeed scholasticide going on in Gaza as we speak. So the real radicals are not the activists. They are Sultan al-Jabbars. They are BPs, ExxonMobil, politicians who think we can green business as usual. They're the radicals that are endangering our lives in the future. Including these geezers. This is Scott Winship. This is not. This is the anti-American bit probably. So he is a representative of a right-wing lobby group, incredibly powerful, a bit like Tufton Street in London. He's right-wing, and you can see there, this is the logic. This is, you know, Thanatos. So Eros and Thanatos in Greek mythology. So Eros is life, Thanatos is death. This is death. But there's money to be made in death. And we have to realise there are very powerful interests ranged against anybody trying to question this particular organisation of our society. And this is what I think my academic colleagues are doing. We're accurately documenting our own demise in ever more fine-grained detail. The time is now, as Karl Marx said, not to interpret the world, but to change it. To move from the head, the cognitive knowing about these things, to the hand. But I think, and again I speak against my own movement in terms of the hard left and so on, too often we miss out the heart. How do you mobilise people? How do you inspire them? Yes, do a bit of the old style preaching as I'm probably doing now. Hellfire and brimstone, and then salvation. It's not a bad model, actually. Tell the truth about how things are, and then say, well, here's what we can do about it together. And that's what we're in now. We're in a cancerous stage of economic growth. It's actually causing more problems than providing solutions. We're making some people very, very rich. And we've created an entire economic system addicted to carbon and also addicted to growth. So it's not going to be easy. So I'm not under any illusion that how difficult all of this is. That's why it's revolution. It can't be piecemeal tinkering around the edges. And did you know this? That fossil fuel use caused the deaths of 20% of humanity every year. 20%, a fifth of everybody who dies on the planet is as a direct or indirect result of burning of fossil fuels. I mean, this is absolutely scandalous, yeah. This did not make front page headlines. So no, it's not just that we're burning fossil fuels is cooking the planet and causing all these climate destabilizations. It's actually killing people. And here they are. Here's a map, and you can see definitely in India and China, but also the parts of Europe and Britain where people are dying. In fact, 2 years ago in London, a young child on their coronary certificate said death from air pollution, the first time ever. So that's why moving away from fossil fuels is not only good for the health of the planet, but our health. And also we wouldn't be dependent upon horrible regimes like Russia or Saudi Arabia. Because when you're an addict and addicted, you've got to get your hit. So 2003, war in Iraq, a war for oil. A movement away from an economy based upon carbon energy is a more peaceful world, to speak to one of the themes of this particular conference. But this is the question. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Just think of our even cultural productions. All these films are apocalyptic and dystopian, and zombies and all the rest of it. Very few are about moving beyond the capitalist system. It's almost like, well, that's like gravity. We can't move beyond this particular system. It's only a human creation. Therefore, we can recreate it. So there is a question here that picks up on what Stephanie was talking about in terms of the fossil fuel lobbyists. The very thing that's causing this crisis. They had the biggest delegation, certainly at the last couple of big international climate change conferences. And yet we know we have to move beyond carbon. So there is a question, and I get the debate about do you have them in the room as opposed to you exclude them. My own understanding, limited as it is, it's a bit like how do we end slavery? You get the slavers in the room, compensate them, that's actually what happened. So is that what we need to do? See that morally we have to make a deal and compensate the people who are causing these horrendous deaths and so on. Including then, remember, our pension schemes are also invested in this as well. So there's a complicated issue, I'm not undermining that. So economic growth, just begin to wind up. So what is GDP, gross domestic product, and economic growth? Well, it's all these good things, goods and services. From personal experience, when I was younger, do not try the first two together. Doesn't end well. But what also adds to GDP? Divorce. Ching ching, 2 houses. Ching ching, the child now needs 2 sets of toys. Ching ching, the divorce couple now needs 2 cars or whatever. The economy's doing really well. Moloch is satisfied. Or even environmental pollution, actually, even though it causes economic loss. Lots of money for lawyers and those in the legal profession going to the court and so on. So there's obviously the economic benefit even from these disasters. And worst of all, and we're seeing this already, if you've got shares in Lockheed Martin, well done. Wars are good for the economy. Wars are good for business, and by God, business is good. Who's benefiting from what's going on in Ukraine and Russia and Gaza and so on? Arms manufacturers. In lovely social democratic countries like Sweden or indeed Britain or Belfast, we have Calais and so on here. And it's often struck me when I was a politician, there's an element in the Good Friday Belfast Agreement that says all ministers have to sign up to a ministerial code that they're going to commit themselves to exclusively peaceful means. You say, oh, hold on a minute, how does that square with saintly John Hume going to America to bring a company to Derry that produced the guidance system for missiles? How does that square with our commitment as we move out of conflict? And again, I'm not saying this flippantly because people's jobs and livelihoods are in these. That's what a just transition means. How do we start moving socially and environmentally destructive opportunity or jobs, North Sea oil, coal miners, weapons manufacturers, how do we move them into something that's socially useful and productive and also environmentally friendly? My own, because I am a proud unionist, pause for effect, trade unionist, is to take inspiration from the Lucas aerospace plan, so we may remember back in the late 70s, early 80s, of the aerospace operation where the unions basically come up with a way of repurposing what was being used to create weapons of destruction into something like 200 socially useful technologies. So it literally was a sword into plowshares. So why can't we do that, including in the university? Let's democratize our workplaces as a way of liberating our imagination in terms of using, not the money, forget about the money, it's the actual stuff that we need to be looking at. Our land, our technology within our societies. And as I always tell my students, why should democracy end at the lecture door? Why should democracy end at the factory door? We're supposed to live in democracies, but most of the time, if you're working, you're living in a despotic, authoritarian regime. Command and control, a boss, and so on. So how can we live in a fully democratic society when so much of our lives are lived under an authoritarian, despotic manner that we only do often to get the wage at the end of the week? But what's not included in GDP? The unpaid work in the home of mostly women. And I'll tell you the reasons why. GDP was invented in the 1930s by a bunch of Western white men. And they excluded the unpaid work of women because it's not a market exchange. It's the reasons why, as John Maynard Keynes, one of the great dead white men of economic thinking, he said, when a man marries his maid, GDP goes down. When a man marries his maid, GDP goes down. Because suddenly, the work that was being paid, remunerated, because the maid was an employee, suddenly becomes a wife doing all the same stuff, but now it's free. Our GDP does not include all that work that goes on. It's mostly gendered. I mean, I know men are getting better, but it's mostly women who are doing this work of caring, compassion, looking after the elderly and young, and so on. This is a community garden, you know, perhaps related to what Ray was talking about. That's not including GDP. All the work that I'm sure many people in this room engage in, that's voluntary in the activities we do in our local communities and elsewhere, doesn't get included in GDP. And disgracefully, the work that goes into democracy, some of us in the room have been involved in democratic politics, that is work. It's bloody hard work. Knocking at people of a November evening when Corrie is on, looking for their vote with a southern accent in a loyalist housing estate. I should have been getting danger, buddy. But again, this work that goes into keeping our democratic system going, not included in GDP. And the issue here, it's an arbitrary creation. It is not some godlike, natural phenomenon. We can change this. And that's why we need to move to things like well-being and ask ourselves these childlike questions. What is economic growth? Why do we need it? No one ever asks these questions. Who benefits from it? And who doesn't benefit from it? Again, can we have jobs, healthcare, housing, transport, green electricity without growth? I think the evidence is there that we can. So again, a bit like the Monty Python parrot, let's give it a good wake, a good Irish wake, thank it for its services, and move on. Why are we still addicted to this particular outmoded, suboptimal and risky economic system? Because essentially, the bit to read is the bit at the bottom of this one here. The capitalist system is like a bicycle. It either goes and grows, or it collapses. That's it. It has no steady state. It has no negative feedback mechanism. That most of us have, for example, our biological entities have a negative feedback mechanism where we don't continue to grow forever. You know, there's a point at which you reach this threshold where you stop growing. And particularly for a human economy, to move from quantity to quality, to stuff to time, you know, from things to love and relationships. These are the things we need to start thinking about, particularly in the global north. So it's not about rejecting growth as always negative or bad. It's the issue of threshold. What's the point beyond which? Or why do we have to continue it forever? Why can't it just be a temporary phase? You know, we grow up. We don't say a child forever, although there's a lot of men child about having this the Bell Donald. But most of us, it's a temporary phase we go through, and then we stop at a particular stage of development. Why is endless growth not seen as a temporary? Because if you're poor, like many countries around the world are in a poor state, growth is where we need, that's where growth should be. Not in our societies, where what we need is redistribution. We don't need growth in our societies, we need a redistribution. You know, and particularly where I live in North Down, that's where you do a lot of redistribution, taking it from the rich to give to the poor. The North Down coast of the haves and the have-yots. Or South Belfast. You know, I think a very popular policy that would get more people behind climate action is tax the rich. The rich are wrecking the planet, not the poor. The people who are coming to take your jobs don't come in a dinghy, they come in a private jet. The people who we should be aiming our ire at is not refugees, but these oligarchs in the media, in business, in politics, and in the academy. They're presenting this mythic ideology of endless growth. And almost like that classic paternalistic, patriarchal male view, it's very complicated, dear. Let me deal with it. That's almost like the way in which our governance system is operating in this context. So, I'm going to quickly, we need to get to this. Donut economics is not taught at university as mandatory. We've got the outer ring, the planetary boundaries that science has established, and then an inner ring of the social floor, the basic needs of people. The sweet spot obviously is in the middle. That's the, the mean between the, going beyond planetary boundaries and people falling below what's absolutely necessary for a decent life. And even now, the IPCC is beginning to move in questioning economic growth. So again, this is a science-based assessment. I've been a Marxist most of my thinking life. I've been anti-capitalist, more for ideological reasons. The way it commoditizes things, it creates inequality in society and so on. But alongside that, you can have science-based reasons for questioning this particular economic. So it's a marrying for me of normative commitments of moving beyond capitalism now to the fact that science is telling us we absolutely need to. And the reality is GDP was never meant. It's not a good measure of progress. Technically speaking, if, say, the Northern Ireland regional economy was to grow by 10% next year, and every cent of that growth went to one person, that's okay. Because the system is amoral. Let's talk about who gets it. Is it distributed? Is it making people's lives better? It was never set up as a measurement of human well-being. And in particular, a measurement of inequalities. Exercises are incredibly unequal. Incredibly unequal. Northern Ireland in particular has the highest levels of fuel poverty. Probably certainly in the UK and Ireland, maybe even in Western Europe, because we have really badly insulated houses and we have such low wages. And we're often oil dependent. Other parts of Britain and Ireland is gas. That's a more, controlled commodity. It's not as volatile as oil. So that trilemma of low wages, badly insulated houses, and heating dependent upon oil makes for the fact, it's a lovely day today or this week, is that when it comes into winter, people will have to make that decision, do I heat or do I eat? And yet we're an incredibly rich society. We need to get more angry. Justly angry. Nobody should have to die. Nobody should have to make that awful decision. There'll be enough resources. It means we're going to have to tax the rich, certainly. The state's going to have to do a lot more. But they're human creations, not something, natural, that's somehow beyond the gift of human beings to do. Just to really hammer home. Every step of this horror story you could read here. Ching ching, ching ching, ching ching. This is the economic system that we have, that most of our policymakers are trying to manage and improve, that most of our politicians are actually parroting, that most of the students at university are coming out with. Is it any wonder, as we'd say in Dublin, we're in a state of chassis? Or as my father would say, we're in a jocker. Because everywhere you look in this, we have all of these intersecting views. This is an ideology. And ideologies can be changed, but we have to be recognised as an ideology. We have different ways of organising the economy. That's the point I'm making. And the reason why tech won't save us, because it's a bit like jumping off a high peak or a building and knitting your parachute on the way down. That's what's being sold to us, folks, by our political leaders, and indeed some in the academy, as our solution. And I'll give you an example. To decouple economic growth, that we can have green growth. We can have the same growth, but we're not going to use as much resources or create as much pollution. And I'm with, whatever his name is, Tony Stark, I call him, Robert Downey Jr. That's come to me. And the reason is this. We had a report come out by the European Environment Bureau a couple of years ago. You read it there yourself, you can see where this is going. And the bit to read is just the one, the bit in bold. There is no empirical evidence we can decouple technologically a growing economy, and yet that is what is being sold to us. And that's what many of us have made as a comfort blanket. The problem with tech will save us. And an example of this is particularly frightening, is this organisation, the International Energy Association. Gives advice to governments and so on about energy. And it produces net zero, that's the classic net zero by 2050. Why not absolute zero? The carbon indulgences kind of issue. So this is what this report said. At least it was honest. Read it there. Half the reductions come from technologies that we haven't even invented. Now, I'm not against technological innovation, but to bet on this, so to reach this target, we're not talking about changing the structure of our economy, move beyond capitalism or beyond growth. No, we have to basically guess, bet, have faith that there'll be some sort of technological solution. This is extremely worrying. Our kids and our grandkids' future are literally being staked on a bet can't we change our economy rather than put all the eggs of our basket in one basket of technological innovation? So, I think we need, as I've said many times now, to move beyond capitalism, both for value-based reasons that I have. You may not share, that's absolutely fine. But remember, when did Jesus get angry? The money changers, and the hint there, I think. There's a connection there between Christianity and certain forms of socialism. Well, I'm offering you here now science-based arguments why we need to do this as well. We need to move beyond GDP and carbon. There are no credible pathways to get to net zero through technological means. So we have to change the structure of our economy. So what I'm proposing is, if the end of the world as we know it, that's okay. It's not the end of the world. It's just the end of the world as we know it. We need to embrace this change and work for it, because it ain't going to come through some optimistic technology or outsourcing to elites. And I'll leave it there with another fantastic book, if you've never read it, written by two epidemiologists, in terms of looking at the impacts of inequality and so on. Particularly for our societies in the global north. I think it's a different story in the global south. We've come to the end of a journey. We're all grown up. We don't need any more growth. What we need is more redistribution. And actually the courage to engage in what James Baldwin said. Let's be honest with each other and try and face the changes that are now necessary. Here endeth the secular sermon.
Thanks very much, John. First of all, brilliant speaker, mostly because you've, I'm sure, prompted a lot of questions and comments and we have no time to really answer or ask them. We're going into our workshops, but just to say, as a minister, I heard more scriptural allusions and references in that last hour than I have in most of the sermons I've attended in Northern Ireland over the last year. And I just, as a historian myself, I'm painfully aware that income inequality in the States at the moment is off the charts. The only time that is anywhere close to it was back in the late 19th century with the Gilded Age. And the income inequality at that point was not only obscene, but was sort of argued for in terms of the idea of social Darwinism. And that's not to throw any shade at Darwin himself. Social Darwinism was a perverse idea. But what changed for America and made us as income equal as we ever were was the social gospel. And really did, when folks started realizing that the Beatitudes was a Christianity that could actually lead to the betterment of other people, not just themselves, something happened. There was much in what you were speaking says, the problem may not be faith, it's what we actually choose to believe and what we actually are willing to give up. So we are including, this notion that we can continue on and on and on and on, and not as Christians face the fact that at some point you need to let things die if what really needs to live on can resurrect.